Hi Lucy, I thought probably the best thing to do would be to just go through some of the ecology stuff so you don't need to write anything down. So I'm going to make a few videos. This is the first of them, and I'm just going to do this one on what an ecosystem is, and then I'll do another on how energy flows through ecosystems, and then another on the nitrogen cycle, and then another on succession. Okay, so remember the module really makes sense only if you've got some sort of background, and the background you really need is to understand what ecology is actually about. And ecology asks two very simple questions. Why do organisms occur where they occur, and why are the organisms in that sort of size of population? Why is it there, and why is it there in those numbers? And we've said, look, they're quite simple questions. They turn out to have quite complicated answers eventually, but actually there are some kind of usual suspects that are the answers to these, and we can divide the usual suspects into two groups, abiotic and biotic factors. So abiotic factors means non-living factors, and here we go, let's go through the non-living factors then. So these are non-living things in the environment that affect where things can live and how many of them there are there. So the typical abiotic factors are light, and we talked about how light has a very strong influence on photosynthesis, and photosynthesis clearly is how plants obtain their energy, and of course plants are the bottom of the food chain, so really light is of critical importance in deciding how much life you can have pretty much anywhere on the planet, and there's a good reason why the tropical rainforests are amongst the most biodiverse, there's the most numbers of living things, and biomassive, there's the most weight of living things places on the earth, and it's because that's where the light levels are highest. And we talked about how temperature can affect organisms, and we looked back through the syllabus and thought, oh, that's all that stuff about enzyme and temperature, and the idea that if it's too cold, the kinetic energy is too low. If it's too hot, you're above the optimum temperature and enzymes denature. But above and beyond that, temperature also affects the rate of transpiration through plants. So temperature has a strong influence on how plants use water, which will have a strong influence on whether the plants can live there or not. If it's too hot, the plants lose water so quickly that they wilt and die. So then we get onto water, and we said there's also a bit of the syllabus we can go back to here, isn't there? We can think right back to the beginning of the syllabus and ask ourselves, what is water used for in living organisms? What are its functions? Remember, there's a big list. It's a solvent, it's a transport medium, it has a high specific heat capacity, therefore its temperature doesn't change very quickly. It has a high latent heat of vaporization, so if I evaporate it, the organism loses heat. It's incompressible, so organisms containing water don't get too badly damaged by being moved around. And then we also said oxygen, and we said oxygen is really only important in certain special circumstances when you're a long way from the atmosphere, so that would be the bottom of the oceans or in under the ground or the top of very high mountains. And we talked about soil, and we said in the case of soil there are particular effects of soil particle size, and we'll get back to them in a minute. And then that's the abiotic factors done. It's a list of 5, they're quite easy to remember. And then the biotic factors, we basically said it's either some sort of predation, so you're either being eaten from the outside by a predator or the inside by a parasite, or the relationship is the other way around. One organism is the host, the other is the parasite. I can just swap it round. So either something is eating them and stopping them from living there, or their food isn't present in that area so they can't live there. Or of course, their food is present in the area and that's why they live there. So my favourite example of this is things I'm terrified of, great white sharks. Actually, if you look at the abiotic factors, there is no good reason why there aren't any great white sharks off the coast of Britain. And we think the reason is that there just isn't the right amount of food for them, thank goodness. And then we said another possibility for biotic factors is that organisms compete for something that gets used up when you use it. So what does that mean? How could it not get used up when you use it? Well, temperature doesn't get used up, does it? But a nest space does. If there's one bird living in that hole in the tree, another bird can't live there. And in some circumstances, water is exhausted by use. I don't think that's the case in the UK because it rains so much, but in other parts of the world it is. And so is light. If a plant is growing over the top of you, then there's not enough light for you to grow. If you're a plant, can you have a U for a plant? I don't know. So number 1 and number 2, predators, parasites. Number 3, competition. Number 4, they can swap services with each other. So we talked about insects pollinating plants and cleaner fish on sharks. And as we'll get onto later, the genus Rhizobium is a genus of bacteria that swap something with plants. So biotic factors, predation, and all the things that are like predation, like herbivory and parasitism, number 1. Number 2, competition. Number 3, some sorts of mutualism. So if we just look at some of these in a little bit more detail, in order to get there, we really need to have some understanding basically of where do we look for the answer. Because I could say, the reason why it lives there is the temperature is wrong, or doesn't live there, sorry, is the temperature is wrong. But the question is, how far away do I look to decide if the temperature is right or wrong, or there's not enough nitrogen in the environment? Well, where do I look? So the ecosystem is kind of like the limits of how far you'd look at the abiotic factors or biotic factors. And sorry, I've just gone too far. So the ecosystem is defined as all the interacting organisms and all the non-living factors that affect them. Now, if you think about that, that's kind of like a circular argument. You look in the ecosystem because that's where the answer is, and then my definition of the ecosystem is that's where the answer is. It's where the organisms can interact with each other and where non-living factors can affect them. So I wouldn't look, for example, at what the availability of food is in Somerset. If I was interested in what the population of frogs in my pond is, I'd look at what the availability of food and the abiotic factors in that particular pond were. So when we look at ecosystems, ponds are a really good example, and there's some sort of other ideas that come out of this, which is that in an ecosystem, energy, which we often look at to answer why does it live there and why does it live there in those numbers, energy comes into an ecosystem as light. The plants absorb that energy and convert it into biological compounds, and then animals and other consumers up the food chain take in that food and use that energy to do all the things they need to do and lose the energy as heat. So energy comes in as light and out as heat. Energy is transferred between organisms within that ecosystem, but we defined the ecosystem as the limit of the interacting organisms. Well, if that's the limit of where they interact, then food doesn't leave that ecosystem, if you see what I mean. So energy comes in as light. Producers convert light into chemical potential energy. Energy moves along the food chain from one organism to another as they eat each other, and eventually all the energy is lost as waste heat. And then my other way of looking at ecosystems is that instead of looking at the energy, I can look at the matter, at the stuff the organisms are actually made of. And there my argument is it goes around in a circle. So if the organisms are interacting with the abiotic environment, then they're taking in nutrients and excreting substances to that environment, but it's only really going so far. And how far that excreted stuff goes is I define as really as being the ecosystem. So matter goes around in a circle in an ecosystem, and the idea is that producers, which are usually plants but not always, remember protoctiscans can photosynthesize, so can quite a lot of bacteria. Producers take in inorganic substances from the environment, and we had a bit of a chat about what an inorganic substance was. And then the matter is handed along the food chain. You take in food from the things that you eat. And then eventually everything dies or is excreted, and the decomposers convert the organic molecules back into inorganic molecules, and then that substance is available for the producers again. And again, if we think about our definition of an ecosystem, the idea is it's a closed system. Matter doesn't leave. It moves between organisms, and it leaves the organisms and enters the abiotic environment, but it doesn't leave that abiotic environment. It's not leaving the pond. The total amount of nitrogen in the pond kind of stays the same year in, year out. If I could tag an individual phosphorus atom, I could watch it move around the place. It gets taken in by a plant, it gets eaten by a herbivore, the herbivore gets eaten by a carnivore, the carnivore poops it out and it sinks to the bottom, a decomposer converts it back into inorganic phosphate, a plant takes up that phosphate again, round and round and round it goes in a circle. Okay, so we've already gone through these abiotic factors, so let's just go through them again and remind ourselves of what we're talking about. So light, why is it important to plants? We talked about this in quite a lot of detail. I'm just going to zip through this slide actually and get on with it. Sorry, there we go. So we talked about oxygen availability, and we looked at this graph, and really what we're saying is this is a skill. And we said that most of the world's oceans are really deep, and because they're really deep, they are a long way from the surface. Dead organic matter sinks to the bottom. Decomposition uses up the oxygen that's in the deep water. The oxygen can't diffuse very quickly in water, so all the oxygen gets used up, especially in the muddy bottom. So this is an example of where oxygen is important as a limiting factor, not to you and me, not at sea level, not wandering around in normal activity, but kilometers down in the ocean, yes it is. We also talked about how it can be a problem in the soil then, and we said that the whole of the upper part of the plant obtains its oxygen either from its own photosynthesis or out of the atmosphere, whereas the roots, of course, can't photosynthesize because there's no light, so they have to take the oxygen out of the air that's in the soil. But the trouble is that some soil contains a lot of air and some soil doesn't contain much air, and we said it's down to the size of the particles. Clays are very small particles. The gaps between the particles are so small that they're full of water. If the gaps are full of water, they can't be full of air. So clay soils tend to have very low oxygen availability in the soil and the roots can die. And then at the other extreme, sand soils with the biggest particles. Sand, the water sticks as a film to the outside of the sand particle, but there's enormous gaps between the sand particles that don't contain any water, and the plant can suffer from lack of water, but its roots aren't going to run out of air. And the happy medium is somewhere in between silt as the particle size, where the water is clinging to the particles, and that means that there's water available, but there's also air gaps between the particles, so that means that there's also air available for root respiration. And then we just looked at a few examples and said, well, look, if we look at woodlouse, so woodlouse is a very strange animal. It's a crustacean. It's actually not in an evolutionary sense. They're not that long out of the sea, and they've still got gills, and their gills lose water like mad. So it means that you find woodlice under rocks and stones in the gardens or in damp places. You don't find them in dry places because effectively they just lose water so fast they dehydrate and die. And then we looked at another example and we talked about olives, yum yum, and we said, okay, well, what's likely to be the limiting factor here? And we had a guess that probably olives can't grow further north because it's temperature, and they can't grow further south because it's too hot and too dry, and it might be temperature and it might be water availability because the two are always very closely linked in plants. And then we looked at this graph that shows what limits plant growth worldwide with a colour scale, and the red areas are primarily limited by water availability, so you can see that most of Australia is not a good place for a plant to grow because it's just too dry. Whereas most of Scandinavia is not a good place for a plant to grow because it's just too cold or verging on being not enough sunlight. And on the subject of sunlight, then we can see that for the tropics, actually there's plenty of water and it's warm enough. And actually, if I could turn the sun up somehow or another, the tropics would photosynthesize even faster. Now, an obvious question is, how does anybody know? And the answer is because they've actually tested it. They've gone out into the tropics and set up enormous light systems and increased the amount of available light and measured how fast the forest photosynthesizes and recorded that the forest photosynthesizes faster. Now, clearly these things aren't independent of each other. If it's hot, plants tend to lose water faster. If there's lots of sunlight, it tends to be quite warm, etc. But that's the basic idea. These three factors, water, temperature, and sunlight, have a global influence on where things live and how much life there is. And then I just gave you an example of somewhere in Spain where all our vegetables come from. So if we go to South Almeria, we find this region that we can see from space, and we see it's made out of greenhouses. That's what all the white stuff is. And the reason why it's there is there's plenty of heat and there's plenty of light in that part of Spain. The thing that's missing in that part of Spain is plenty of water, but there's plenty of water here because there are mountains just to the north that in the winter have snow on them, and that water flows downhill to this region and means that this region has a surprisingly large amount of water for somewhere that's basically, most of Spain down there is a semi-desert. I don't know if you know the Western, the good, the bad and the ugly, but all those 1970s spaghetti westerns were filmed in the deserts of Almeria. Okay, that bit of Almeria is where your courgettes come from. It's where your peppers come from. It's where your aubergines come from because there's enough water. And then we just briefly went through some examples of biotic interactions, and we said, here's an example. Here's a beetle that lays its eggs in dead mice. Here's a fly that lays its eggs in dead mice. Here's a little mite closely related to spiders, tiny little things that hitchhike a ride with the beetle. And it turns out that this is a really good example of a mutualism. So when the beetle arrives at a fresh dead mouse, it lays its eggs in it, but so do the flies. If the mites aren't present, the fly maggots hatch out faster and they eat the beetle eggs and they eat all the food. So there's intense competition between flies and beetles for dead animals, if you like, to bring up their young on. And what's happening here is the mites are basically acting as a symbiote, as a mutualist, and helping the beetle out. So the beetle and the flies are in competition with each other, but the mites and the beetles are in mutualism with each other because the mites are there right at the start. They don't need to hatch out. They're already alive. And they eat the fly eggs. They don't eat the beetle eggs. They just eat the fly eggs. So the mite is doing the beetle a favour, and the beetle is doing the mite a favour. The beetle is carrying the mite to somewhere where it's going to find fly eggs to eat. All right? A good example of how mutualism and competition can kind of go hand in hand like that. And then we said, well, look, there's the really obvious biotic interactions like predation, but that would also include herbivores. So here's a non-obvious one. Our friend the slugs, yum yum. They eat seedlings, disastrously so. And we talked about your garden and how your parents are always having a continuous war against them. And I said, look, there's really loads of experiments done all around Britain where they've kept slugs out of wild areas. And if you keep the slugs out, you get loads of buttercups, because it turns out that slugs have a real preference for buttercup seedlings. So there's a good example of a biotic interaction limiting where an organism can live. You don't get huge amounts of buttercups where you get lots of slugs. If you remove the slugs, you get lots of buttercups. So to summarize then, we said ecology is that branch of biology which works out what controls abundance and distribution of organisms. The ecosystem is the limits of where we expect to find the answer to that question. And it's defined as being where the organisms interact and where the non-living factors affect them. Ponds are really good examples of ecosystems, otherwise it's kind of difficult to think where the border might be. And we said energy flows through ecosystems, and we'll come back to that in a bit, and matter cycles within ecosystems. And then we said the abiotic factors that are usually the factor that controls whether the organisms can live there or not are light availability, water availability, temperature, oxygen availability, and soil factors. And we said there's some complications here, and you need to be aware that these abiotic factors kind of reach back into the syllabus from stuff we did right at the start and stuff you've done about photosynthesis recently. We talked about how in the case of soil, particle size is the important factor because it controls both water and oxygen availability, and they're kind of like inversely related to each other. If you've got big enough spaces to have air, they tend not to have much water. If you've got small enough spaces for lots of water, they tend not to have much air. And what you want is somewhere in between with medium particle size silts. And then we've said this already, just summarizing, the biotic factors include predation, which would include herbivory and parasitism, and competition and mutualism. And we define them as a predation is where one loses and one gains. A competition is where they both lose. And mutualism is where they both gain. So in predation, one species benefits off the other. In competition, both species lose out compared to how well they would do if they were on their own. And we gave the example of the postman delivering a cake. You might get 90% of the cake, but if your brothers and sisters aren't home, you get 100% of the cake. And we talked about mutualism and how in a mutualism, both species benefit from the interaction. That'll do.